The island of Ireland was on the cusp of political unification towards the end of the Edwardian period. Only the determined opposition of Ulster Unionists and their allies in Great Britain prevented this from occurring. Loyalists exhibited genuine feelings of besiegement and isolation between 1912 and 14, and many observers believed that Ireland was, by the early summer of 1914, on the verge of civil war. My forthcoming book, Friends in High Places, Ulster's Resistance to Irish Home Rule 1912 to 14, tells the story of Ulster's organised resistance to the Third Home Rule Bill, and in particular assesses Ulster Unionist political and propaganda campaigns. The central focus of this book, due to be published, as Eamon mentioned, by the UHF in just over 2 months' time, is its examination of the vital interdependence of Ulster Unionists and the British establishment during the late Edwardian period. And as I said, it's this theme that I would like to focus on tonight, as well as concentrating on the Covenant. First of all, the context. Proposals to establish a parliament in Dublin responsible for administering the whole of Ireland had first been mooted by William Gladstone back in 1886. It was largely the resistance of Ulster's Unionist community, both in 1886, when tension over the proposed legislation sparked sectarian rioting in Belfast, particularly in the west of the city, and again in 1892 to 93, that resulted in both the Liberal Premier's Home Rule bills being rejected by the House of Lords. When another Liberal administration was returned in 1906, the threat of Irish Home Rule again returned to haunt Protestants in Ulster, especially after the powers of the Upper House were trimmed by the 1911 Parliament Act. Herbert Asquith, reliant on the parliamentary support of John Redmond's Irish Nationalist Party, decided to introduce another Home Rule bill during the spring of 1912. With the support of the Irish Nationalist group at Westminster and the reduced powers of the Lords to dismiss legislation which they didn't like, basically, Asquith's chances of success were deemed to be much greater than those experienced by his Liberal predecessor, Gladstone. Loyalists in Ulster had started to prepare for the likely re-emergence of the Home Rule threat a few years into the 20th century. The Ulster Unionist Council, the UUC, had been formally established in March 1905. It was a democratically structured body with the purpose of providing a representative, centralised policy-making group which would possess a permanent executive committee and also contribute to devising and disseminating political literature. The Unionist Associations of Ireland, UAI group, was especially prominent in the latter area, and pamphlets and political postcards expressing Ulster's political, economic and religious opposition to the proposed measure were designed both in Ireland and Great Britain and distributed across the country. And I believe John Killen was speaking last week here about political postcards and propaganda. Many of these cards, and I include some of them in the book, they were very interesting because they did concentrate on many of the central reasons for loyalist opposition to Home Rule, and their appeal was direct, appealing for the support from the British public, using the image of John Bull. There was one particular one of a crumbling, newly built Belfast City Hall, which was the anticipated outcome, they thought, if Ireland got Home Rule. And also, there's another one which John may have shown you last week, which looks at a poor Ulster colleen about to be savaged by the evil Home Rulers in their midst. So the propaganda was, which is an area I'm very interested in, as some of you may know, it was very, very sophisticated. With the resurgence in support within the ranks of the Orange Order and Lord Templeton's revived Unionist clubs, and the unequivocal, if not universal, support for Ulster Unionism from across the range of Protestant churches. The only flaw in the Unionist armoury on the eve of the Home Rule crisis was the absence of strong, dynamic, and charismatic leadership. The image I've got up there is it's an unusual one which I uncovered in the Belfast Telegraph's Historical Library, and it's one of Edward Carson with senior figures in the Protestant churches speaking to a loyalist gathering in North Belfast at Cave Hill. This would soon be rectified, this absence of quality leadership, by the appointment of Sir Edward Carson as leader of the Irish Unionist Party in February 1910. Edward Carson was a somewhat surprising choice for the leadership of Irish Unionism. Although a fine public speaker and an experienced parliamentarian, Carson was both an outsider, he was a Dubliner, of course, who was relatively unfamiliar with Ulster, and a man who had made his name and fortune in the legal rather than the political sphere. In many ways, Edward Carson was a complex and at times contradictory character. Although continually fretting about his health, he pushed himself through frenetic parliamentary schedules and long speaking tours of Ulster and Britain, and he coped with the loss of his first wife, Annette, at the height of the Home Rule crisis. As his opponents ceaselessly taunted him, there was a stark contrast between Carson, the leading criminal lawyer of his generation, and Carson, the Irish Unionist leader, whose fiery rhetoric and chilling menace appeared to border on the illegal and unconstitutional. He also combined an unusual mixture of high political principle and pragmatism. Accepting the IUP job in 1910 and declining to stand to the leadership of the Conservative Party the following year, Edward Carson displayed genuine political courage and integrity. Opting to take a post which promised little personal gain, but rather extreme pressure and arguably danger, Carson showed that he was not a politician on the make. Yet he would also, notably in his reluctant acceptance of the Government of Ireland Act in 1920, display a political realism which ultimately took precedence over his principles. Ironically, Sir Edward Carson's political legacy, a diluted version of Home Rule for most of the province of Ulster, represented the antithesis of what had motivated him to accept the challenge offered by this new role back in 1910. Although he would save 6 counties of Ulster by his slick campaign of 1912 to 14, the IUP leader, like in fact nationalist boss Charles Stewart Parnell over 20 years before, had been unsuccessful in achieving his prime political objective. I'd like to spend most of my time looking at my theme, Friends in High Places. Behind me, just in case I forget to mention it, is an image. I'll send it to Gordon Lucy at the start. There are 3 major Balmoral meetings. I'll talk about the first one in a second. But the signing of the Covenant was remembered in September 1913, and that's where this photograph was taken. And it was also remembered in September 1914, weeks after the start of the Great War. Friends in high places. Political isolationism during this period of prolonged crisis would undoubtedly have proved to have been the final blow for Ulster Unionists. Instead, they were able, like their nationalist counterparts, to enjoy a mutually beneficial relationship with the Conservative Party during this short but vital period. This unprecedented degree of support for Ulster's Protestants, which was at times unrestrained in some sections of the party, was all the more surprising given that such a close interrelationship blatantly implicated the Tories, the party of law and order, with a movement seriously threatening the wishes of Parliament and the maintenance of public order in Ireland. This was predominantly attributable to conservativist desire for political power, as Jeremy Smith and others have pointed out, and Irish Unionists' urgent need for political backing at Westminster. A new Tory leader, Andrew Bonar Law, who would subsequently become Prime Minister in 1922. He had been appointed in November 1911 with the task of reuniting a divided and dispirited Conservative Party. Bonar Law, with his strong Ulster family connections, quickly realised that the best way to achieve party loyalty and party unity was to commit the Conservatives to even greater protection of Ulster's loyalists. Apart from an emphasis on national unity, what lay at the centre of Bonar Law's political approach to Ireland was the principle of electoral consent for major constitutional change. He also quickly realised the emotional appeal of Ulster's case, that of the beleaguered patriotic minority in Ireland, and committed his party to the unconditional backing of Ulster's Unionist community. Bonar Law delivered a series of hard-hitting speeches of Home Rule, both in Parliament and also on many political platforms across Britain, including this one at Balmoral Showgrounds. Undoubtedly, his strongest commitment came at Blenheim Palace. Some of you may know it. Strangely enough, I was there last year in Oxfordshire in July 1912. At this Oxfordshire gathering, ironically at Winston Churchill's family seat, and Churchill, of course, at that time was a liberal and a great opponent of Ulster Unionism. At this Oxfordshire gathering of predominantly British Unionists, Bonar Law assured Ulster Unionists, and the language is very significant, I think, that if any attempt were made to deprive these men of their birthright as part of a corrupt parliamentary bargain, they would be justified in resisting such an attempt by all means in their power, including force. The Tory leader pointedly added, and you might want to compare this with more recent Conservative leaders and prime ministers, pointedly added that he could imagine no length of resistance to which Ulster can go, in which I would not be prepared to support them. Although wary of senior party figures like his predecessor as IUP leader Walter Long, who were anxious about neglecting the interests of Southern Irish Unionists, Andrew Bonar Law generally enjoyed the support of the vast majority of his parliamentary party, including former leader Arthur Balfour and the flamboyant Liverpool barrister and close friend of Carson, at least at this time, F.E. Smith, who spoke at many Unionist and Orange meetings in Ireland and Great Britain. Party strategists also believed that Ulster was a major vote-winning issue. Supported by a plethora of propaganda literature, postcards and posters distributed by Ulster and Irish Unionist pressure groups, Ulster proved to be the difference between political success and failure at several by-elections in Britain in the 2 years before the outbreak of international war. Over 5,000 election meetings relating to Home Rule were staged in England, and over 3,800 were held in Scotland. Bonar Law, Smith, and many other leading Conservative figures were involved in numerous political meetings, some of which had been incorporated in political tours, or what I call in the book roadshows, by the Tories and Irish Unionists. No large British town or city was untouched by Ulster Unionist rhetoric between late 1912 and the early summer of 1914. The largest of these meetings, and I go into many of them in detail in the book, but the largest of these meetings was staged in London's Hyde Park in April 1914. Well over 100,000, some estimated 150,000, and the Belfast Telegraph stretched their readers' imagination by claiming 500,000, witnessed the march, and speakers addressed their vast audience from 14 different vantage points in the Central Park. City stockbrokers marched alongside Oxford Street shop workers and dockers from the East End and the Millwall docks in a massive support of solidarity with Ulster's loyalists. The Belfast Telegraph trumpeted that Hyde Park had witnessed, and I quote, a joining together of hands between the world's metropolis and the metropolis of Irish industry. I'd like to look at the aristocracy next. The role of the aristocracy in influencing the Unionist campaign, both in Britain and Ulster, cannot be underestimated. As we know from watching Downton Abbey, the Edwardian era was still an age of class difference, and the practical and symbolic part played by aristocrats and landowners in the Loyalist campaign was considerable. In Ulster itself, the upper classes, although not always to the fore in political decision-making, they did have a crucial role in persuading ordinary people that their cause was a just and honourable one. Although it would be business leaders and professional men like James Craig and Edward Carson who would dominate the Unionist movement, some aristocrats, most notably Lord Londonderry, proved to be invaluable lieutenants, and he and many others attended or chaired key anti-Home Rule meetings. The Lords spoke at major demonstrations, they hosted political speakers, and they loaned their expansive estates for the purpose of UVF training and drilling exercises. This particular one, which we unearthed in the Belfast Telegraph Library, shows a UVF parade demonstration in the depths of South Down at Narrow Water Castle, which was the estate of Captain Frank Hall, who was a leading figure in the Ulster volunteer force. Local peers, including the Earl of Erne, Viscount Templeton, the Duke of Abercorn, Viscount Castlereagh, and the Earl of Kilmorey, all spoke, and many others, all spoke at major political gatherings, including Craigavon, Balmoral, Blenheim Palace, and of course the Covenant Campaign. UVF drilling and the stockpiling of weaponry, post-gun running, took place at stately homes like Narrowwater Castle, Barons Court, Castle Upton, Clandyboy, and Killyleagh Castle in County Down. Surviving photographs of such occasions indicate, this is the thing that struck me, comparing it to the 1970s and 1980s, indicate the cross-community, classless appeal of UVF membership. For instance, one UVF group pictured in the Belfast Telegraph, training at the Duke of Abercorn's Barons Court estate, consisted of, and I quote, 2 Presbyterian clergymen, a barrister at law, an engineer, a Church of Ireland clergyman who was in charge of the group, a solicitor, a merchant, a farmer, a motor engineer, a carpenter, and an auctioneer. Apart from the unambiguous offers of support emanating from Ulster's aristocracy, many of these lords' wives, womenfolk, give fulsome assistance to the Loyalist campaign, leading ambulance corps, and I've got a slide to show you later on that, and organising fundraising. Perhaps the most noted individual, and I go into her in more detail in my book, was Lady Theresa Londonderry, whose salon diplomacy at Londonderry House in London and her presidency of the Ulster Women's Unionist Council, the UWUC, give her a high profile in a largely male-dominated movement. Backing for the Ulster Unionists also came from that most predictable of sources, the House of Lords. The crisis in Ireland coincided with major constitutional change at Westminster, with the Liberal administration's Parliament Act eroding the powers of the upper house. Despite the reduction of their powers, the Lords contained a large number of right-wing Tory diehards who pledged themselves to a vociferous denial of the wishes of the lower house and a rejection of Asquith's Home Rule Bill. This reactionary group was led by the quixotic young Conservative peer, Willoughby de Broke, who is very much a creature of his times, a one-off, as we might describe him, whose support for Ulster was seemingly unconditional. He declared that he and his colleagues would volunteer for active service in the event of Asquith opting to, quote, coerce men and women whose only offence is that they wish to remain inside the British Constitution. De Broke joined forces with other Tory peers in an unsuccessful amendment which aimed at forcing Asquith to call an election on the Home Rule issue. Yet it was his extra-parliamentary endeavours to support Ulster which were to prove most effective, again as Jeremy Smith pointed out, both in promoting the case of loyal Ulster and in sustaining pressure on his party leader, Bonar Law. In March 1913, Lord Willoughby de Broke established the British League for the support of Ulster and the Union. This pressure group, which quickly harnessed the backing of over 120 MPs, 200 peers, had central London headquarters, and by 1914 boasted the membership of 10,000. A host of agents, about 400, were engaged at local level across Great Britain, organising or helping to organise pro-Ulster rallies and liaising closely with the recently formed UVF. Indeed, Willoughby de Broke, who, as you can gather, was a bit of a character, embarrassed the UVF staff leadership by offering more practical services, insisting that he could ride and shoot like the best of men. An associate of Willoughby de Broke was Viscount Alfred Milner, a leading imperialist and former South African High Commissioner. Inspired by the success of Carson's Covenant campaign in Ulster, Alfred Milner decided to organise a British Covenant, a British pledge of support for Ulster in 1914. This was advertised in the national press and was eventually signed by close to 2 million Britons. Lord Milner also published a British Commentator magazine and cajoled the great and good of British society to lend both their moral support and more fundamentally their financial backing. Generous contributions, and of course I won't go into detail here, but the money was basically used for UVF guns and as well as propaganda. Generous contributions came flooding in, including help from the seriously wealthy, Lord Rothschild and Waldorf Astor, cultural celebrities like Edward Elgar and Rudyard Kipling, who I just go into detail about in the book, and leading military and naval chiefs, including Seymour and Roberts, General Lord Roberts. The latter, and particularly his Irish-born protege, Sir Henry Wilson, were to act as conduits between the Tory establishment and the officer class of the British Army, who were increasingly sympathetic to the plight of Ulster loyalists. And this, of course, would manifest itself in the Curragh Mutiny of March 1914. At the head of Britain's establishment, even the relatively new monarch, George V, was in danger of being drawn into the Irish quagmire. The king, although anxious not to breach constitutional convention, was concerned by the predicament facing military officers and also at the prospect of the breakup of his kingdom and the potential dismantling of the British Empire. Although he avoided using overtly sympathetic language towards the Ulstermen, it is likely, in fact, it's more than likely, that George V shared the aspirations and fears of the aristocratic class towards Ulster, and his genuine concern that civil war was about to erupt in Ireland prompted him to host an albeit abortive conference of nationalist, unionist and British politicians at Buckingham Palace in July 1914. I'd like to look at the next theme and the next source of great support for Ulster Unionists, which came from the British press. The Edwardian age was a golden one for British journalism. A much larger, mainly urban-based and increasingly literate population avidly devoured a wider range of newspapers, which were now designed to entertain as well as to inform. Politicians like Edward Carson knew how important it was to court the gentlemen of the press. And here we have Carson doing an impromptu press conference in the grounds of Craigavon 3 or 4 days before the signing of the Covenant. It was also the age of great newspaper men, both editors and press barons, both in the radical press, which I'm not going to talk about tonight, but, and also the Tory press. And probably the most celebrated of all of these, I'm not going to say Rupert Murdoch, was the Irish-born press magnate Alfred Harmsworth, who was later created Lord Northcliffe. He was labelled the greatest man who ever strode down Fleet Street, and he owned several newspapers, including the first one to sell 1 million copies a day, the Daily Mail, and also the most influential and the world's oldest newspaper, the London Times. Although at times he chided the London Times editor, Geoffrey Robinson, for his over-exuberance in support of Ulster, Harmsworth's own strong sympathies with Carson's movement were undeniable. As the crisis neared its peak in the summer of 1914, Harmsworth's newspapers devoted substantial space to covering the situation in Ulster in particular. They had 17 correspondents. The Mail had 17 correspondents in Ulster in the early summer in June, July of 1914. They also had sympathetic editorials and, of course, cartoons which lambasted their opponents. Sympathy for Ulster was unflagging, even when loyalists might have appeared to have blotted their copybook. So therefore, the Times chose to attack the government rather than the importers of an arsenal of weaponry in April 1914. It described the day after the gun running, it described the essential solidarity of Ulster's Protestant community and warned that the population so united and determined cannot be dealt with by such measures or threats. They were referring to the Home Rule Bill and, of course, the threats imposed in the Curragh incident. The other newspapers, like, of course, the Express, the Spectator, the Daily Telegraph, the Morning Post, and the Observer, the Pall Mall Gazette, all of these and others give enormous support to Ulster. And the other kind of iconic figure of the Tory press at this time was J.L. James Louis Garvin, who was editor of the Pall Mall Gazette and also the Observer. And Garvin actually took a great interest in going over to Ulster and covering the key events. On Covenant Day, he stood in a perilous position by the dome of the City Hall, looking down on the historic scene below. And he wrote in his Observer report, interesting, the Observer was a Tory newspaper then. You get your head around that one. But Garvin actually praised the concentrated will and courage of Ulster's loyalists. In my penultimate section, I'd like to look briefly at the Covenant, and I know my colleagues are going to come back to this. Ulster Unionists realised that their campaign needed to be broadened to obtain more widespread support from the British public, and also to ensure that the passions of their more extreme followers might be properly checked. Carson's movement certainly received a boost from a tactic devised by B.W.D. Montgomery, developed by others, including Thomas Sinclair, the Reverend Alexander MacDowell, and James Craig. Modelled on the Scottish Covenant some nearly 3 centuries before, but appealing more directly to contractual notions of citizenship, the Ulster Solemn League and Covenant was unveiled to an enthusiastic Ulster public during the late summer of 1912. It was proposed that men and women would be invited to sign 2 separate documents expressing their objections to Home Rule after a concerted appeal and campaign across the province that September. And this is what happened. There were many meetings, which I'll describe in a minute. This one shows Carson going through Belfast with the head of the Orange Order at the time, Colonel Wallace. Again, this is not new. I haven't seen this photograph until I did my research in the library. It's not one that's usually shown. The Covenant itself, if I could just briefly refer to that, it was proposed that there be 2 separate documents, one for men to sign and one for women to sign. These documents would express loyalists' objections to Home Rule. There would be this big campaign across the province. And sensibly, those who drafted the pledge kept it simple. There was no ambiguity regarding constitutional terms or references. It was, and in fact, the pledge, as you can see here, was fundamentally contained in a single paragraph. And it summarized loyalists' fundamental objections, and this is why it's very interesting as an historical document, to Irish Home Rule. And significantly, and perhaps surprisingly, the first objection here was an economic one. being convinced in our consciences that Home Rule would be disastrous for the material well-being of Ulster, civil and religious freedom. So, I mean, the economic objection to Home Rule was clearly stated at the beginning, and other objections were stressed, like the religious one, the political one, and the imperial one. Emphasis was placed on maintaining religious freedom, rather than employing overtly sectarian references to Catholicism or the Pope. References to citizenship and imperial unity were featured in lines 4 and 5. I won't repeat it, you can see it there. Where Home Rule was described as being potentially destructive of our citizenship and perilous to the unity of the empire. Significantly, no references were made to gaining parliamentary approval for their actions, but only the interventions of God and the monarch were sought. And very much this document was a defensive document, although it did ominously contain the phrase, using all our means, which you can see later on. The Covenant campaign started in the far west of the province on the 18th of September. Nationalist representation and support was strong in Fermanagh, but the initial Covenant demonstration at Petora Hill in Enniskillen indicated there was considerable backing for the anti-Home Rule message. Another 8 meetings, major meetings, were staged in towns and cities across Ulster, including gatherings in Lisburn, Londonderry, Portadown. Unionist club members and Orange Order personnel were to the fore at these demonstrations, where several Unionist spokesmen denounced Home Rule and whipped up enthusiasm for their message of no surrender. Many English peers and parliamentary representatives visited Ulster, especially for the closing stages of the campaign, including, not surprisingly, Willoughby de Brooke and F.E. Smith. But the Conservative Party leader himself, who had been severely chastised in the radical press for his outspoken comments, had a convenient excuse not to attend because he was summoned to Balmoral. That's the castle, not the showgrounds up in South Belfast. On the eve of the climax of the campaign in central Belfast, Edward Carson, and this is the programme of that meeting, addressed a solemn, thoughtful audience in the Ulster Hall, assuring them the following day would prove to be a great step forward in their campaign. The post-meeting scenes in Bedford Street were memorable. A crowd estimated at 25,000 had gathered, and the Covenant Committee had wisely erected a platform over the glass porch of the building's main entrance, where Carson was presented with a faded banner reputedly presented to King William at the Boyne. Covenant Day itself had been arranged to take place on Saturday the 20th of September 1912. It proved to be a crisp yet sunny autumnal day, devoid of showery rain or dark clouds. In an era when Saturday morning work was commonplace, Belfast's large industrial workforce had been granted an additional half day's leave, as all major industrial and commercial firms closed their gates. The atmosphere in one of Britain's busiest cities was almost surreal, as the clang of the hammer, the throbbing and whir of machinery were no longer heard. Across the city, in the little side streets of the Shankill Road, men were swapping their labouring clothes for Sunday suits, orange sashes, and other loyalist regalia, whilst a few streets away, in the Nationals' Falls district, Catholic workers were appreciating a rare lie-in, although doubtless also fretting over a possible sectarian clash or possible sectarian trouble later that day. There wasn't, incidentally, but that was the fear. Edward Carson perhaps enjoyed a final cigarette, heavy smoker he was, as he strolled through the grounds of James Craig's Sydenham mansion, before joining his trusted lieutenant in a limousine which took them back to the Ulster Hall. The prayers which were offered in the Ulster Hall that morning requested God's protection and deliverance at this time of national danger, as well as requesting the Lord to grant to our people such patience and self-control that no occasion of bitterness may have power to move them. The congregation, both in the Ulster Hall and in dozens of churches and community halls across Ulster, joined together in a hearty rendition of O God, our help in ages past. Buoyed by this display of communal unity and spiritual sustenance, Carson and senior Unionist party figures made their way on foot to Belfast's relatively new municipal headquarters. As he entered the grounds of the City Hall, the crowds were thickest in Donegal Place and Royal Avenue and the surrounding streets. Flags and loyal bunting flew from shops and commercial buildings around Donegal Square and parallel thoroughfares. Unionist club marshals, led by Major Fred Crawford, guarded the perimeter of the huge building as RIC officers adopted a low profile. Dozens of signing desks had been placed along the building's numerous corridors, which would ensure that up to 540 people would be able to sign the covenant at any one time. Belfast's Great and Good welcomed the IUP leader at the building's entrance. Small talk would have been kept to a minimum as Edward Carson, a familiar image this one, as Edward Carson was motioned to a circular table draped with a large Union Jack close to the entrance and below the main staircase. In a moment of high drama, Carson deliberately paused to look up at the large group of cameramen and newsreel makers before signing the most important political petition in Britain since those of the Chartist era nearly 70 years before. Across the length and breadth of the province, enthusiasm for the Covenant came close to matching that expressed in Belfast, as thousands of agricultural workers suspended their harvest preparations and made their way to sign the Covenant in town, village and church halls, as well as at country domains. In the end, close to 500,000 men and women signed Ulster's Solemn League and Covenant, and it was a happy, relieved Edward Carson, because there wasn't any violence that day, and that was the fear, who waved a fond farewell to cheering crowds in Belfast's centre and docks area that evening. Incidentally, it would be a few days before Carson actually made it home to Rottingdean in Kent, because he had major meetings to address on Merseyside and Clydeside. Carson himself expressed the view that the proceedings in Belfast had been a huge and magnificent success, and the Unionist press were euphoric in their assessment of the occasion. Certainly the impact of Covenant Day was immense. It had brought loyalists together in a symbolic mood of defiance, and it also had illustrated the organisation ability of Unionism's leaders, particularly James Craig, as well as the self-control of their grassroots supporters. However, the propaganda capital gained by Covenant Day did not produce any immediate political gains for Edward Carson's party, which still had to counter the stubborn refusal of the Liberal administration to treat its resistance seriously. Despite the powerful message of dissent transmitted by the campaign and its resulting 500,000 signatures opposing Home Rule, the bill trundled its way through the parliamentary system, its ultimate passage guaranteed unless there was a sudden change in government policy or a general election was called. And I just want to come finally to what I call my epilogue. And I've got a few more slides just to show you very quickly. Although Unionists continued to persist in their parliamentary opposition to the measure, a further amendment, this time instigated by Carson himself, had been defeated in the Commons in 1913, and strong resistance was maintained in the Lords by Tory peers. Yet the IUP leadership soon realised that a further diversification of tactics was needed in order to prepare for an increasingly imminent physical battle, and also one that would win over the hearts and minds of the British public. Now, that was partly achieved by the propaganda campaign, which I've described, by the quality political literature, the political tours across Britain, but it was also the result of a more aggressive strategy sanctioned by Carson and his senior colleagues. Evidence of this can be found in the formation of the Ulster Volunteer Force in January 1914, and the drawing up of contingency plans by the UUC for an emergency or provisional government which would be established in Belfast to govern Ulster in the event of Home Rule being passed and being implemented. Liberal resolve to see the measure through was seriously tested early in 1914 with a setback at the Curragh military camp outside Dublin, where military officers refused to serve in Ulster if Home Rule was forced upon it, and also by the successful importation of an arsenal of weapons by Major Fred Crawford in April 1914. I'd just like to show you some the final slides and then have my final comment. This shows Carson out inspecting the ranks of the UVF outside the Ulster Hall in July 1914. Women actually were quite prominent in this movement, and there was a women's auxiliary, an ambulance corps, and with the leadership coming from the aristocrats' wives, and this is one such inspection. I mentioned the gun running. They got all kinds of sophisticated weaponry, including machine guns. Again, this is the early summer of 1914. A little bit earlier, that one, the massed ranks of the Ulster Volunteer Force. Again, this is the, I think this is Tyrone, this one, UVF drilling there. And I think this is the final one. This particular one, Paul Carson, the Telegraph's librarian, discovered this one. And this is very interesting. This is September 1913. And it's a contingent of UVF members and Orangemen getting ready to march to Balmoral. This is taken, if any of you live up that way, you might well recognize it, Fort William Park up in the north of the city. Okay, just to conclude, inside a few months, April of 1914 we're up to, inside a few months there was apparent stalemate as the bill neared the end of its parliamentary journey. And, and this was personified by the lack of progress made at the Buckingham Palace conference, which I mentioned earlier. Only the onset of the Great War and the suspension of the Irish Home Rule Bill until the end of hostilities would there be a respite in tension across Ulster. By the time the attention of British and Irish politicians returned to Fermanagh and Tyrone's dreary steeples, the cataclysmic events of the Great War and events in Dublin during the Easter of 1916 meant that a very different political landscape had emerged in the British Isles. This was one in which a war-weary British public would be less sympathetic to parties resisting negotiation or compromise, and where a speedy resolution of the Irish problem, which is constantly called in England, was universally approved. David Lloyd George's Government of Ireland Act in 1920, which established two parliaments in Ireland and partitioned the island, was Britain's proposed solution. Yet, and I would contend this quite strongly, although this was a post-war solution of the Irish crisis, acceptance that the northeast of Ireland was different to the rest of Ireland had been acknowledged before the start of the war, and this was fundamentally, if ironically, the product of the resolute campaign of the Ulster Covenanteers and the support that they got from their friends in high places. Thank you.